Hello, everybody. This is Darren Redmond, and on this episode, we're going to talk about something that is so important to our culture, our society, and for generations is just ignored. Well, I shouldn't even say ignored as much as it is used to the benefit of some people at the expense of many people. And my guest today, on again for the first time, Kevin Dahlgren, has really gone out of his way for decades, 25 years in social services, trying to put a stop to this, or at least bring attention to it. I love his moniker of disruptor of the homeless industrial complex. I am so happy to have Kevin Dahlgren on the show today. Kevin, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it more than you know, and we want to get into some of the tales and the stories that you tell. But for somebody who might not know exactly what you do, not familiar with We Heart Seattle and Portland and some of the other things, give people a little glimpse behind the curtain of what you do.
Well, I have worked in social services over 25 plus years. My primary focus has been working with the homeless population. I started working in, not the nonprofit sector. I have said for the first 10 years of my really career, I admit I was part of the problem because I just trusted my supervisors and had faith that what we were doing was the right thing to do. And I really didn't have a say in any sort of decision making. So I just sort of followed along, right? But over the years, I was just growing more and more frustrated with what I was seeing and experiencing working for these nonprofits. And what I say is what once felt like a cause became this multi-million-dollar industry, and now multi-billion-dollar industry, where there was no real focus on actual metrics or measurable results. So we kept doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, or we kept doing the same thing over and over again with the end result not ever being the permanent solution. And so then I realized what we were doing is just enabling. So as far as, my day job is, I work for a successful homeless program. We Heart Seattle, I was their president for just under 2 years, and I recently resigned so I could focus my energy back in Oregon, because We Heart Seattle was formed in Seattle, Washington. And
Right.
so I'm kind of focused more on the state of Oregon right now, and my time was really divided and stuff. So as you know, I do a lot of work going out and talk to the homeless, working with them, doing the storytelling, getting to know them, finding out where is that disconnect? Why are they still out here? Why are people languishing and dying? Help people understand the rise in the fentanyl epidemic, or really just the drug epidemic, and why we're not treating this like the crisis it is. And that's why I say I'm a disruptor, is we're not acting as if it's a true humanitarian crisis or a state of emergency. We're just not. And how I know this is because, for one, 90+% of every homeless person I talk with tell me I'm the first outreach worker to ever talk to them. Right. And if this is a multi-million-dollar industry, where are they? Where are the ones out there every day working with them, building that trust? It's just not happening. It's very frustrating. And when you really dig down deep to find out, well, where is the money actually going? You find that it's just being wasted. There's a lot of money gets spent on major housing projects, which admittedly is a permanent solution, but for very few people. So for example, the county or the city or the major nonprofit will build an apartment building or whatever that maybe is able to house 30 to 40 people. But they also spend several $1,000,000 building this, and they then pay the rents of these 30 to 40 people for life. And the problem with that is that where you no longer our number one goal is to help the homeless we work with reach self-sufficiency, or at
That's so important.
or at the very least meet their fullest potential. And
Mhm.
we all know that not every single person in the streets can become self-sufficient because of mental illness and stuff, but you can help everyone reach their fullest potential. And if we focused on that, I would say 80+% of every single homeless person, not even in Portland or Oregon, but in the United States, would become self-sufficient. And that would save us billions of dollars. So I get frustrated when all this money goes towards this permanent solution of this just drop in the bucket of people. Then we have to continue to pay for their way for the rest of their life without any real focus on, say, recovery. And
Right.
I will really quickly share that I used to work with a man at a men's homeless shelter, and I sat basically with him for several years. And he was living in one of those apartments. He was street homeless. He was a heroin addict. But when I met him, he had been sober for about 8 years and had been working for full time for 7 years.
Right.
And so then I finally ended up working, by the time I finished work with him, he had been fully full-time employed for 15 years and sober for about 15 years. And guess what? He still lived in this apartment that was completely covered. He had become self-sufficient, right? But the system still said, we're going to pay your way for the rest of your life. That to me was completely insane. I'm like, well, why don't you give this up to somebody in need? He goes, why would I? This is the best deal ever, right? And
Right.
that's the system. That's the industry. Is for him, that's in some ways, I mean, obviously it's a success story because he got clean, he's working, but where it wasn't a success is that the system continued to support him.
Right.
So
But
that's insane.
he became awarded the state is what happened.
Yeah, and he didn't need it. And that, so sometimes when you do permanently house a person without even trying, that's going to happen, right?
Right.
And so in those cases, why wasn't there some kind of then requirement? Well, now that you've been sober for this long and working, we wish you the best. Move out and get your own place because we need to move someone else in. This is why I'm a strong believer in not permanent housing, but everything should be considered transitional housing.
Right.
Because when you treat it as transitional, everybody has the understanding that eventually you just have to move. And
Right.
again, as I said, that isn't going to be the case with 100% of them, but it definitely is going to be a case for a high 80+%.
Oh yeah, and it's funny. I'm listening to you and I'm taking some notes here. And the one thing that I can hear already in this world that we live in these days is, oh, what are you trying to say? We're going to throw them out on the street? Or no, that's not what you're saying, in my opinion. And again, tell me if I'm wrong. But when you build something like this, how do you build something like this and not have a end game in set? That would be like you and I putting together a movie and not having an ending. And
Uh,
that's what happens.
I mean, it's good business.
Right.
The
Of
fact
course,
is,
it's a profit center for those people.
the fact is, every homeless person out there really has just a dollar sign on their head. They don't
Yep.
even realize just how valuable they are to this dysfunctional system. And
Mhm.
you can approach almost any homeless person and they're going to name four. Well, you can approach any homeless person that's actively working on housing, like actively wanting to get off the streets, and you can name 4 to 5 professionals attached to them basically doing the same job. So that's
Right.
another thing, is there's a duplication of services.
Oh yeah.
And people have asked me, well, like, that's outright corruption. And I don't believe like deliberately people are trying to be corrupt. It's just there's a lack of oversight.
Correct.
There's no communication between agencies and there's no metrics. So it's not like they all got together in this dark room and said, ha ha ha, this is what we're going to do. But
Mhm.
because there's no oversight, because there's no metrics, this is what the end result has become.
Yep.
That's the problem. So I'm a big believer in transparency and, you know, Anytime an agency says we don't talk about it or something, that should be a red flag.
Oh, it's a
Right?
cover up. In my opinion, again, opinion, that's a cover up
Yeah.
for what something's going on. Time to dig deeper. And again, let's take that person who's 7 years now clean, they have a job. Through that time, there should have been transitional housing, in my opinion.
Mhm.
5% of your paycheck needs to go toward this, 10%, whatever the case may be, and start reloading the system instead of just doing a money grab to take the money out of the taxpayer or some federal grant somewhere. But it's easier to do that because you can say, look at us, we built all this housing and look how great we are. And
Well, messaging wise, optic wise, it looks good. Because optic wise, you can point the camera at a new building and be like, look, this is a solution.
right,
But what they don't say is it's a solution that's so minuscule that ironically, because you're really enabling these people for life, that the 40 plus people you permanently housed, we now have another 500 people in our major city who have heard about this permanent housing and want the
Right.
same thing. So it's not actually reduced homelessness whatsoever. It's probably actually increased homelessness because
agree.
cities like Portland, Seattle, San Francisco are thought of as sanctuary cities.
Yep.
It's the place to go because people know that there's a decriminalization of drugs. Lawlessness reigns, right? There's no camping policies.
Right.
And this is why people come to these communities, you know?
And what happens, and again, not everybody, I'm sure there are wonderful people out there and wonderful organizations. I want to be clear about that.
Of course.
But here's what happens. So I was listening to something today on this issue. So what happens is let's give that gentleman a name. Let's give George a name like George, okay? So we give George that barely get by housing for free, right? And I'm making millions of dollars in grants and money and input and in prestige and marketing and everything else. That's a good trade for me if I'm a selfish individual. I'll give you just get by, and now you will live in perpetuity and just get by. You won't have any of the skill sets that you and I are advocating about coming in there, learning how to be self-sufficient, learning how to invest, learning how to grow, learning how to move from that home to a start home. You are robbing that person of those things because you're giving them a home for life and nothing else. There's no skill sets that are along with it.
And I like that you are robbing them of that. And this is what I say is we should be empowering as individuals, not enabling. When you empower a person, you give them control of their lives, which means we're not feeding them peanut butter sandwiches to the day they die and pay their rent. What we're doing is we're teaching them life skills and preparing them to become self-sufficient, right?
Correct.
That's how we're going to end this crisis. And it's just not happening. And, again, and it's true, not everybody's the same out there. And there's some incredible people I meet every day on the streets who want to be off the streets, but don't know how to navigate the system. Nobody's talking with them. And everyone says, well, you can just call this number or do this. I'm like, yeah, have you ever tried to call this? It's a complete nightmare.
Oh, it's hard.
Or have you ever tried to go in? It's very difficult. It's hard enough for the people, let's say, a solid outreach worker that's really good, has integrity and passion. They're pulling their hair out every day trying to wade through this complex system. It's very, very difficult. And you understand why the homeless finally just gave up and stopped trying. And this is why I go out there every day and talk with them is I'm trying to get the policymakers, the legislators to listen that to end this crisis, to solve this problem, you have to understand the problem. And because a lot of them, unfortunately, know the problem and don't care, I've now been exposing this to get voters to listen. Because if they're not going to listen, then we need to make a change of people in office.
Well, absolutely. And the whole system, in my opinion, needs an overhaul because we have the same people, in these elected officials in these capacities And they're not evil people as much as they become indoctrinated in the system, and that's all they know. And we don't hold people accountable. Look at it. It's not the same thing, but somewhat close. Today, I saw a posting that you did on Twitter. And those who don't know Kevin's Twitter, you should go and follow it. Where somebody was talking about the people that we were speaking about yesterday, living inside a bridge. You're like, hello, I talked about that a couple of weeks ago. Here's my stuff.
Yeah.
They make it, and here's the horrible thing. They make it one of the many. They make it sound like they found this issue out, which if that's what really happened to them, shame on them that they're not out there doing some research. But even worse is they had to have known that you or people like you have done that.
Well, yeah, and it was about 6 or 7 weeks ago, I was doing outreach, and when you're out there daily, what you're doing is building trust. And once the trust is built, they open up about other things going on. And just in particular, I'm working very well with this homeless guy. And one day he said, "Hey, Kevin, do you know about the people living in the bridges?" And I said, "Did you say in the bridges, not under the bridges?" And so I was intrigued because under the bridges is common. And
Right.
so he walked me through this encampment and down this trail and showed me this hole. And I was like, what the heck? And I looked inside and I saw all this trash and graffiti and blankets and pillows and tents. And I was like, oh my God, are you serious? Right. So I made a little video. I filmed it. The location is there. Everyone knows where it is. And I made it public. And I said, there are people living in the bridges. This is no place for people to be. People aren't getting their needs met. So lo and behold, 2 days ago, there was a major fire inside this bridge in which there was about 12 people in there, and there was only one way in and out, and the hole was no bigger than this, right? Which means you had to squeeze out one at a time. So once this fire started, imagine how terrifying it is, because smoke engulfed the very area. People could have easily suffocated. A homeless guy I talked to heard the screams of people inside, from that hole panicking. So the fire department arrived. Only luckily one person was hospitalized, but what I heard is multiple people were burnt and had smoke inhalation, but it either ran off before help arrived or did not want to receive help because they were scared they're going to get in trouble, because this fire caused obviously tens of thousands of dollars of damage. But I had already brought this up and shared this with, city leaders and stuff, and nobody, as far as I know, went there and did anything about it.
Because again, it doesn't hunt for them for whatever reason. And they just moved on to something else, whatever that is. Like, this time of year really gets me. And I was thinking about this morning when I knew we were going to talk today, and not being glib. But I hear radio talk show hosts, people taking polls about should we do daylight savings time or this or that. And I'm like, people like Kevin are showing that people are at risk of burning to death inside bridges, and other things are going on. Nobody cares.
Well, it's not even at risk. People are languishing and dying every single day because we don't treat this like the crisis it is. People don't always want to know about the tragedies around them, right? But what I would argue, and I say this, is that we could end this crisis in months, not years, if we'd all just listen, we'd all work together, right? This isn't a political issue. Everybody, regardless of what your belief system is, if you just care enough to know that this person is never going to get their needs met on the streets, let's work together and solve this. Then we can talk about all that interesting stuff that isn't hurting anybody, right?
Oh, absolutely right.
And
so, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So yeah, and I agree. It's like, there's a reason why people want to ignore it, because they also get frustrated thinking they've accepted the fact that there's no way out of this crisis and it's never going to end.
Right.
And while I say it's not a political issue, some of the powers that be will say, homelessness, the root cause of homelessness is capitalism. So only when capitalism is defeated will homelessness end. So I hear this a lot. And while I respectfully disagree, it also doesn't matter if there's a person in a tent right now on a sidewalk blocking anyone's ability to walk on the sidewalk. That's a community issue and we should solve it. Then once we end this crisis, let's all reconvene and talk about the root causes.
Oh, listen, I
But
agree.
but I will say this is the root cause of most homelessness is not capitalism, but it's a childhood trauma. I would say
Yes.
90% of the time you talk to the person, get to know them, it is childhood trauma, which then leads to addiction and or mental illness.
Mhm.
Okay. So, when they say capitalism, they get into this saying like, these people have been squeezed out. And that can be a fair argument, a small percentage of the time, right? There's always going to be an affordable housing argument for some people. They
Right.
got squeezed out, and I 100% agree because like Portland and other cities are very expensive. But to say that's the root cause is completely insane, and also tells me, have you ever spoke to a homeless person? And when I
Right.
hear an elected say that, I'm just like, gosh, I wish they'd go out with me because that's
Mhm.
just such backwards thinking. Like, give
Yeah,
me
it
a
really is.
break. And that's just a joke. I was in Seattle. Well, I go to Seattle regularly, but last year I was in Seattle, and I was talking to someone who was running a nonprofit, and she told me homelessness will end when Jeff Bezos is no longer a billionaire, and Jeff Bezos is the founder of Amazon in Seattle. And so I'm like, so what you're saying is that the person who owns Amazon, once he stops being a billionaire, this homelessness crisis will miraculously disappear. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And she's in charge.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
that tells you everything you need to know.
and that's completely insane. Of course, once she said, I was like, wow, I really have nothing in common with this person. So I was like, all right, you do
Right.
you. I'm going to just keep doing my job. And it's such a backwards way of looking at the world. But and also this does a disservice to the homeless. Like if they heard that, to be like, what the hell is wrong with this lady? Right?
Right.
Because the homeless are so wonderfully truthful and authentic. They'll tell you
Yes.
exactly what the hell's going on. Yes, I use drugs. Yes, this happened to me. This is
Oh,
going on.
thank you. So you're so right in saying that. And again, we're not trying to say that they're the greatest saints in the world. There's a vast array
Of
of people
course,
better than others, but they live in truth. They live
they
in
do.
truth.
And hey, uh, yeah, we at times we need to hold some of them accountable for their actions. There needs to be behavioral changes, right?
Mhm.
But they will almost always tell you what is going on and how and what how they ended up there and what's it going to take to
If
get
they
them off the
trust you,
streets.
if they trust you, if
And trust is key.
yeah,
And there's the right way to build trust, and there's the way that's never going to happen. The right way is to go out there daily, regularly, get to know them, talk with them, never lie to them, show
mhm,
mutual respect, right? And just be very honest with them as they're honest with you, right? And over time, that trust is built. And once trust is established, hope returns because that's the ultimate goal. Because once they have hope, they're willing to trust you enough to follow through with almost anything. How they're not going to trust you is if you do a once a year check in with them
yep,
or give them a piece of paper saying, call this number for
mhm,
housing. And then you call the number and it's either disconnected or it says, well, actually, that's one step of 5,000. And how do you wade through it? How do you do this without having someone to help you through the system? And so the mistrust comes from they're fed up with the system. They're fed up with the outreach workers that do exist and the nonprofits. And so when I meet a new homeless person, sometimes they are immediately like, who are you? What's going on? And actually, one of my tweets over the last week or so, a lady I was talking with said that exact thing is she apologized to me on camera. She goes, Kevin, I'm so sorry I went like this, right? She says, I didn't know you. I thought you might have been an undercover cop or had an agenda, da da da. And I said, hey, I'm only here to understand you and to hopefully help you and listen to you and give you a voice, right? And so
right,
now that the trust is built, I've seen her again And, she yelled at me from across the street, Kevin, right? She said, hi, because that's how you build the trust,
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've mentioned this before on previous podcasts, and I'll just make it short and sweet. You don't need a PhD in social services. You need an understanding that people are people, and,
Yep.
you start there. So, for example, and I tell this to a lot of people who are just getting into volunteer work, and whether they're with a nonprofit or something else. This isn't double Dutch. When you're talking to somebody, in this case, who's either has mental illness, addiction, homelessness, you don't have them start talking to you, cut them off, and then just say, here's a place you can go, or how'd you get this way, or this and that. How about being an active listener? How about you don't say anything, but actually sit there and listen, and if they are mumbling or just going back and forth, just sit there with patience and understanding.
Yep.
And like something that you said when we talked a couple of days ago, nobody asked to be homeless. Nobody got up and said, when I grow up, boy, I can't wait to have a lot of childhood trauma, and then I want to be homeless. That's a life that's really fulfilling. No, it happens. And people get into survival mode. And sometimes when you're in survival mode, it's not pretty, but they're trying to survive. And you show somebody a little respect, it goes a long way. And
yep. And and speaking of what you said about having a PhD, is the way this system is set up now is to even work in the system, you oftentimes have to be highly educated. But what you don't have to be is highly passionate.
Right.
And so here's how I hire. I hire for passion first, experience second, education third, right?
Yes.
In the system, they hire for education first. We don't care if you have experience or passion, right?
Right. Exactly.
So it's because it's another check mark is we have 20 master level people working for us, right? But if you don't hire a passionate person that's hardwired and driven to end this crisis, it doesn't matter what their education or experience is. It just doesn't, right? And I have a good education, but the thing is, on the streets, it really doesn't matter. All that matters is, do you care about this? Do you have the courage to go out there and talk with them and get to know them and spend the time? And that doesn't take an education. And as far as the people, the policymakers in charge, I put money on it. A majority of them have never even spoken to a homeless person. What they've done is they've read 50 books on homelessness, got the education, started as a manager at a nonprofit, and is now in an elected position or something, but they have very limited experience making decisions on a group of people they know really nothing about.
Oh, absolutely. And I remember reading an author, he wrote a book, and he talked about the myth of experience. And he was talking about how some person on that resume, this person worked for Pac Bell at the time, and they had 20 years at this position. And well, no, you really only have 1 year of experience 20 times over. You really don't have any.
Yeah.
The experience that you claim you have. I've been in this industry 20 years and helping people do this, that, and the other. Well, what have you learned over the 20 years that's different from when you came in?
Yeah.
I want to know that. What's that like?
And that's another excellent point is, in the system, the longer you're there, the more value you are and the more you're trusted. But the problem is, if you've been there the entire time this crisis went from a cause to a multi-million-dollar industry, that actually makes you part of the problem. And so you may have a lot of experience in the system, but have you been doing the same thing? And have you been contributing to this humanitarian crisis, but with broken policies?
Right.
And actually it's not, it's something I've been thinking about lately it's not always a bad decision that got us in this place. What makes many of these people in charge of like homelessness throughout the West Coast of the United States primarily, isn't that they make bad decisions, it's that they've made no decisions.
Right.
And that's what makes a bad leader. A good leader may make a bad decision, learn from it, and then make the right decision. A bad leader doesn't make any decisions because they're scared of making the wrong decision. And
Right.
so they just sort of, we've been in this like holding pattern, with homelessness, to be like, well, let's just continue to give them tarps, tents, sandwiches, needles, or whatever, because we don't really know how to solve this. And so that's what just contributes to the problem, is they're not making any real decisions because they're scared of making the wrong decision.
Well,
And that's what makes a bad leader.
so to me, without making it sound like an episode of MASH, everything that you just suggested is triage, and there's a place for triage, but triage isn't a policy as much as it should be a stopgap. So if somebody needs a talk before we can get them into whatever, or needs a towel, or whatever the case may be, or a sandwich, because I haven't eaten in 5 days, I'm new to Portland and I don't know where to go. That's different. But when and what happens is we do that as a society.
Yeah.
And that's all we do. And the money that's supposedly floating in, I want to know where it goes, because again, I don't know where it goes. That's all I'll say. As people's homes get bigger and their cars get newer and all that other stuff, certain people. But triage is not a solution. To your point, it was so brilliant, is when I'm helping that person, I'm helping their next generation. How does that person become self-sufficient? Because right now, what we're doing is we're giving them, we're a feudal system, because what happens is we'll give them just enough to get by, and they'll die eventually from either addiction or from being out in the elements, because that's where they are. We're not putting them in places that will give them those long-term things.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that people? Well, I just want a long-winded question. I'm sorry. So on the East Coast, for example, I mean, it was the West Coast too, but people came here in this country. They couldn't speak the language. They were living in squalor, but within 2 or 3 generations, they had homes. They had thriving lives, not perfect, but they were living what's called that American dream.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like the more and more that certain kind of individuals or governments got into place, that all went away.
Yeah. When the government will intervene too much, it ends up hurting, not helping an individual. Correct. I'm a big believer in individual rights, and a lot of these more extreme progressive views ends up actually hurting person, not helping them, by completely controlling everything they do, what they eat, what they think, everything. And I say what they think because these days, if you don't say the right thing, you're canceled.
Oh, you're crushed.
And especially middle-aged white dudes like you and I, we're just like the spawn of Satan to some of these 20-year-olds.
Absolutely.
And it's if you don't say exactly the right thing, right? And that's sad, right?
Oh, 100%.
And so there's certainly a large group of people that obsess more about that than the actual crisis, right?
Yep.
And I've never, sometimes I'll encounter protesters, adding comments saying like, we're here to support you. And I'm like, well, and I ask, how are you supporting them? What are you doing exactly? They're like, we're going to stand here in solidarity. I said, okay, but what do you mean? Right, they're like, we're going to do. And so I would point out, well, you see that lady curled up in a ball there? She told me that she was sexually assaulted last night. You see this guy, I believe he's overdosing. This person appears to be underage. Are you going to just stand in solidarity with them? They're like, yes. I said, well, why not roll up your sleeves, get to know them and help in another way? They're like, well, no, we're going to stand in solidarity. I says, that's not what they need. No. They need real, actual help.
Right.
And that's what's going on a lot. And that's it's so sad.
Yep.
Right.
You'll take your photo with your candle and put it on Instagram or Twitter. And, how about you, when you're lighting the candle, stand next to the person freezing to death, out who's homeless. How about you do that? At least that the candle now will have some value. And again, any way you can help, great, all for it. But when that becomes official policy, it's ridiculous to me. And it's a shame. And I see these families, and like you mentioned, unfortunately, the sexual molestation that happens to these people is horrible. And
Yeah,
it happens
and
all the time.
for a new female on the streets, anytime I find them and they're brand new,
Mhm.
um, what I have to say to them, it's not if, but when.
Right, right.
It is a when, because it's virtually guaranteed. I challenge anybody to find a homeless woman on the streets that wasn't on some way sexually harassed or molested or assaulted, because it's extremely common on the streets, right? I've been talking to a lot of fentanyl addicts that tell me, because the addiction is so strong, there's a lot of people that drive around looking for, you know, vulnerable men and women who are so desperate for their next fentanyl pill,
Right.
will get into their car and do anything for
Mhm.
that money. Now, technically speaking, this is the argument, is, was that consensual? If a person is desperate and in the middle of their addiction and have lost rational thinking and or critical thinking and rational thought, is that still considered consensual if they say yes for their next hit and the person then takes advantage of them? I would say no. I would still say that is a form of rape, because they're
Oh,
not in their right mind, and
absolutely.
and uh, you know, there's a chemical element to this decision-making process.
Listen, I'll use this comparison because it works. Predatory lending, right? I mean, there's law against predatory lending. People don't know what they're doing, and they
Mhm.
sign that loan anyway. That's considered predatory lending, not good. Those people who are not in their right mind because they are just needing a fix, that's not consensual.
Mhm. Yep,
It's just not consensual.
it is not.
And people need to realize that.
And people are being victimized every day, as some of these policymakers and a lot of these nonprofits are sitting around talking about social justice causes and stuff, rather than actually seeing the people in the tents right below their window and figuring out a way, what can we do today to help them?
Right.
So what I like to use as an example of this is the system in a nutshell. If you hear a man screaming and you run to the lake and you see a man drowning, right? If you're any regular human being, you're going to jump in and save him. If you're the nonprofit homeless shelter complex, you're going to go home and do a study to determine why he fell in the lake,
Right.
right?
Right.
So when the
It's
person is
unfortunate, but it's so
drowning,
true. It's a great analogy.
when a person is drowning, it shouldn't matter, did he fall in, did he jump in, or was he pushed?
Right.
All that matters is there's a drowning man and we should save them. But
Mhm.
the system will be like, well, let's do a study,
Right.
right? And I say, after we pull them out, do that damn study, right? Once
Right.
they're saved. And I say that because that seems to be the case, is they're all talk and no action, right?
Right.
At
Right.
the end of the day, somebody has to be the ones out there doing the work,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And and that is the piece that it's not easy, but it's simple. There's a difference. You do the work on these people, and these people meaning all of us, because it is a community problem. But I'm going to hit you with, because before we wrap up, I'm going to hit you with something that really came to mind when you were talking about childhood trauma. And I agree with you that almost every case there was childhood trauma. Do we in America realize how much we are screwing up kids? We're abusing kids and using kids, and we're just treating them like crap, because that's what's going on here.
Mhm. And different types of stressors in our personal lives affect people differently, and
Mhm.
trauma is different for everybody. And so I'll use an example. For some kids, when a divorce happens when they're, say, 12 years old, it's fine and they're excited about having two Christmases.
Right.
For another 12-year-old, it could be devastated and think this is my fault, and it carries it with them into their adulthood, and they become an addict. Because
Right.
I've met many homeless people that really, when you get down to it, they actually grew up in a fairly loving household, but the parents got a divorce, and that to them is the trauma. So trauma isn't always about I was raped when I was 6, I was
Mhm.
beat up, I was in a car accident, whatever. Sometimes it's something that we see some people as a little more on the minor end, but trauma is different for everybody. And so that's why, I'm a big believer in talking to the person, identifying what their trauma is, and to help them. It's different for everybody. The fact is, when you're a child, you're very vulnerable and things affect you sometimes in ways you have no concept of, and sometimes comes back to haunt you when you're 50 years old, right?
Right.
You start having those dreams of like this reoccurring dream. So I'm a big believer in like counseling and talking to
Me
people and
too.
letting them open up. And because the fact is, as humans, we're all pretty vulnerable at times,
Oh, yeah,
we're
absolutely.
emotional, right? And we all need support and stuff. And so why I spend so much time sitting with the homeless is sometimes, you know, they just need that human connection, which was another, I think, a recent tweet a few days ago of this guy I met who, oh yeah, as I approached him, he's like, I just want to kill myself. He was mumbling that. And right at that moment, I sat with him and said, "Hey, do you want to talk?" And what I did is I placed my hand on his shoulder, and I'd never met him before and talked with him. And he just looked at me for a moment, and I'm a complete stranger. He didn't like push it away. He desperately needed someone to make that connection.
Right.
And we sat and talked for about 30 minutes, and he finally just completely changed his mood. And he
Mhm.
says, like, it's just sometimes people just need that. And
Yep.
he said, if you had not come along, Kevin, I don't know what I would have done.
Right.
And that's another reason to be out there and do outreach. And what
Oh,
I say is this is a call to action, is stop waiting on the system to help these people. Anybody, volunteers can participate. Or if you're unable to do that, donate your time in other ways or money towards profits or people that are making real differences.
yeah.
Because,
And by the
you
way,
know,
people, investigate where you're throwing your money, because there's a lot of these scam places out there. That's all I'll say. And
and
you want.
so that's why I say it's not ever a great idea to donate money unless you really know the program or the person. But
Mhm.
that's why I say usually donate your time.
Right.
But
Agree.
but there are, as you said earlier, there are great programs. Sometimes say I'm just critical of everybody. Well, I'm critical because I expect the best out of them, but there's also a lot of great smaller programs making real differences every day. I am critical of the system as a whole, the ones that are making 95% of all the decisions that have created this sort of industry.
Oh, absolutely. And so you use the term homeless industrial complex. I really want to leave on this note. If somebody was to say, Kevin, what does that mean? How do you answer that question?
Well, it has different meanings, but really what I'll say is what I said earlier is, homelessness is a cause, right? It is a humanitarian crisis. And while I call it the homeless industrial complex is because what once was a cause became this multi-million, now multi-billion dollar industry. And it's an industry because every year we ask for more money and every year we get it. But every year the homeless crisis grows, which means if money were the solution, we would already solved it by now.
Correct.
And so this industry is in place with jobs and nonprofits and infrastructure and programs there to, you would think, support this crisis, but really it just kind of enables the crisis, you
Oh,
know. And so really, if you dig deeper, a lot of it is bureaucracy, right? It's
mhm.
almost impossible if you're motivated to get help to receive help. And that can be it's extremely frustrating for someone like me that isn't homeless and has a roof over my head and eats well and stuff. If I'm pulling my hair out, what are they going through?
Well,
You know?
I mean, it makes me think about, for example, you probably heard this. New York City a couple of years ago, they outlawed giving homeless people food. That you couldn't just go out there, a restaurant, or you just go out there and give to somebody. That they wanted to force the homeless to go into these places that to eat. And I'm saying, wait a minute, whatever happened to just helping your fellow man? I mean, if
Yeah.
instead of me throwing away half my sandwich, for example, I'm just using a gross
Yeah.
exaggeration, and I see somebody down the street who I know his name or her name,
Well,
hey, let me, what happened to that?
well, and I think what you're describing is in any community, uh, they're one of two things. They're either all carrot or all stick.
Correct.
All carrot is we're gonna shower you with as many resources as possible and help you to the day you die, but not really help, but just give. And then there's the other cities saying like no to homelessness, no to this, no to this, and strict policies, and that's all stick. What I say is in this crisis, it's a balance between both of those things.
100%.
Meaning there has to be policy in place, there has to be strict expectations, but there also has to be enough resources to help these vulnerable people. It's that balance, right? There has to be a little bit of carrot and a little bit of stick, a little bit of accountability, but also a hell of a lot of compassion.
Yeah, I mean, that's like anything else in this world. If you give somebody just all carrot, they're not learning anything. You give somebody all stick, they're just going to cover up, they're not learning anything.
Well, in all stick, you know what that does? That forces the problem on the community next to them.
Yes.
And so like, you know, people, this is where I'm going to defend Portland is a lot of people come to the city because it's easy. But the thing is, there's a lot of homeless here that are out of state transplants because those communities basically said complete no and not helping in the right way. So they came to us. And so it's not fair to us they've done that, right?
Agreed.
Every community should take care of their own, right? And
Agreed.
so while I'm going to still fault some of these cities, I'm going to give them, you know, they're 75% at fault. There is a percentage where it's just like, look, people also come to these communities because they were kicked out of others because there was no services.
Oh, yeah.
There is that balance.
And, you know, I think, and we might have this discussion before. That's a wonderful way of looking at things. Let me finish this by saying it's not just this one thing. There's usually a plethora of different indices and variables. That's life. And we need to look at it. And that's the problem, by the way, with the PhD approach to anything. Because if it doesn't look good on a spreadsheet that they can put out for a thesis, they're going to say that it's nebulous thinking and you can't quantify it. Thus, we can't use it. No, I'm sorry, you can't. If I was to say, if you and I were to go have dinner and I was to say, this pizza tastes delicious, I could tell you it's got the cheese, it's the sauce, but I can't really tell you what's making it wonderful to me and only okay to you, but that's okay. You're not looking to write a thesis on that. But the homeless problem, the trauma problem, the addiction problem, many times is being solved, with air quotes, by those who are just scholastic and have their PhDs, and they like to listen to each other talk as they publish books and get foundational money. And people who are out there struggling continue to struggle, and nothing gets solved.
Well, and not even struggle, but languish and die.
100%.
And that's the biggest tragedy of all is, and one thing these programs are masters at doing are the messaging. They're the ones saying, we're the saviors, we're going to end homelessness, we're helping people, we're all compassion, we're pure love. They say all these things that kind of pull on the heartstrings where you're like, heck yeah, I'm going to vote for this. Heck yeah, I'm going to give you more money, because not everyone works in social services. You know, we are one of hundreds of industries, right? And you might be an engineer who has never talked to a homeless person in your life, but has strong views of like, I want the homeless to be helped, so I'm going to vote for this. But 9 times out of 10, they're voting for the wrong people and they're contributing to the wrong programs.
All right.
And that's the problem. And that's how it continues, because that's the messaging, is the commercials and the the speeches, you know, and social media presence saying like, you know, it's we're here to help, we're doing amazing work. Well, guess what? Do your research, Google them. Have they been around for 15, 20 years? Have they received more money than anybody else, yet this crisis is growing the city? If that's the case, they're not part of the solution, they're part of the problem.
Correct. But it just continues, and it's because of people like you who hopefully it'll change. Kevin Dahlgren, but before we go, how can people get in touch with you, follow you, find out more about the work that you do? Because you have a fan in me, quite frankly, and I support the work that you do.
I appreciate that. Of course, you'll add my full name and stuff in links, but I do a lot of posts on Twitter because it's a good place to do the storytelling. I oftentimes will discuss the system or interview the homeless, help people understand the nature of addiction and homelessness and mental illness, things like that. And that's kind of, and I do like to write, and I try to get things published in, op-ed pieces published. So I had a piece published in the New York Post last month. So I like to write and really just kind of share my experiences of doing this for a couple decades now.
So have you given any thought to doing a documentary film? Because I think your stuff just screams to documentary.
Well, people have asked me that a lot, and I will say is I have the footage, I have the photos, I have the videos. I guess what I need is I now need the producer.
Right.
Because that's, I do a lot of editing myself, but I do think that's going to be the next logical step is just talk about homelessness in a longer format,
right.
Like hour and a half, 2 hours and stuff. So, and I've participated in several documentaries the last couple of years, but it wasn't my own documentary.
Right.
So it might be something I'll do in the future. Really depends. Maybe someone will come along my way and want to help with that. And it's something I'm certainly open to. But you can mostly, find me on Twitter. And if anyone ever had any questions, they can message me and ask. And, while I get busy at times, I'm also happy to talk to people on the phone and also sometimes go out and do outreach with them. It just depends. Especially I'll do this for like elected officials or people interested in learning more that also have the ability of contributing to the system in a meaningful way, right? So not just like fans who we love your work because I'm so busy, but I really want to also work with people who are very passionate about this cause. So if that is the case, reach out to me and I'm happy to talk.
Kevin Dahlgren, thank you so much for being my guest today on Again for the First Time. And you're a good person, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Be well.